Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. I sat down again for another conversation with Russell Newquist, who you may remember from earlier. He's it's a kind of long list, a programmer, a fourth dan karateka in Shinigami karate. He's a instructor, 4th degree black belt. Where he runs the dojo. He is also a publisher. We run Silver Empire Publishing, a small growing indie publishing house. Which, by the way, actually at the end of this month will be publishing my murder mystery, The Dean Died Over Winter Break. So, did that. He's, I talked with him about the Lioness Project, which is a short story project, as well as other things previously. And he's also an author, publishing himself the novel he wrote the novel War Demons, as well as Vigil and a number of short stories. So, he's an interesting guy. And a lot of fun to talk to. And so we talked about the topic of reader expectations and how that forms fiction, and how this can impact things like predictability versus being in a genre and stuff like that. So it was a really interesting conversation, and hope you enjoy it as much as I enjoyed being in it. So we're going to be talking about an interesting subject we've both talked about somewhat independently, which is the subject of reader expectations versus things like a story being predictable. And so I'm really curious, because I didn't actually encounter, Russell, your previous take on it. So what are your thoughts on that subject of predictability in a story versus reader expectations?
Well, I'll pick up a little bit with where we were talking a few minutes ago before we started recording, Chris. You were mentioning the difference. I'll just give a brief summation as well. That what one reader picks up from a book looking to be what they're expecting out of a book to meet certain expectations, another reader might find as, oh, this is too predictable and straightforward, and I'm not interested in it. What we've found, I'll just come at it from the perspective of marketing books and selling them to people, is that those tropes, you can call them, are actually in many cases literally what defines a genre. So if you're trying to, let a reader know what kind of book it is that they're getting, those genres are really kind of there. They're there for the readers, not for the writers and not for the publishers. They're there for a reader to kind of know what they're getting. A great example of that, I'm going to go to my old fallback because it's the one that everybody loves to hate, which makes it fun to talk about. And I think we talked about this some last time I was on your show, is Twilight. It's a wonderful example of this because everybody rags on Twilight, right? And everything they say about it is correct. Okay, the characters are very flat. The writing is not exactly high prose.
I gained a new appreciation for it after reading Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, though. I actually went back. I actually was reading through my copy of Twilight to find sections to compare, and I was after like 100 pages of Atlas Shrugged. I was like, why did I dislike this so much? It's actually not that bad. As I was looking through Twilight. Anyway, forgive the interruption.
And there's a lot of plot tropes in there that make a lot of us gag, especially if we happen to have a Y chromosome, and everything's there. But a lot of the reason people hate it is because it's not their genre. The things that you and I in particular dislike about that book, and that most of my friends that I know dislike about that book, really come down to the fact that, we pick up a book like Twilight, the way it's marketed, the covers that are on it, what it's put out there, and we expect it to be basically some kind of urban fantasy, supernatural thriller kind of thing along the lines of, say, a fairly wide spectrum, but along the lines of anywhere from like Buffy the Vampire Slayer to Dresden Files, somewhere in that kind of territory is kind of what we go in looking for. When really the book's a romance novel. And so if you go into it looking for the tropes that match, something like Buffy or Dresden, you're really going to be disappointed because they're not there. To put it lightly, because like so many people are who rag on the book. But if you go into it looking for the tropes that match a romance novel, you're actually going to find that it's a really excellent example of that genre that excels very well. Now, there are a lot of us out there who really don't care for that genre at all, and so they rag on Twilight all the time. And frankly, many of those people would rag on Twilight just as hard if it were labeled as a romance novel as well, because they rag on romance novels. But romance novelists make a lot of money because there's a very wide market out there that does like that genre, because they're expecting those exact tropes. They're looking for them. And so to somebody who doesn't like those tropes, it's a massive turnoff. But to somebody who likes them a lot, that's what they're looking for, and it's a wonderful bang-up job of. And in fact, I would argue it's one of the best examples of that genre that's out there, which is why. What's her name? Stephanie Meyer? Is that the author's name? It's why she lives in a house made of gold bars, because she's made a really excellent example of her genre and managed to market it very well to people who like that genre. And also, this is the part that really irritates me, but also made her very rich. She managed to market it to people who really like romance while packaging it as a non-romance novel, so that they didn't have to be quite so embarrassed when they were picking it up, which is brilliant marketing. But I hate it because she stuck it in the genres that I do like and ruined them, because now those genres, if you walk into a bookstore, are full of Stephanie Meyer clones instead of the books that I want to read. So that part I'm angry at her for. Thankfully, there's Amazon where you can get around that. But things like my own company, Silver Empire, where we're publishing things more like what I want to read. So whether anybody else does or not is a different story. But I want to read them, so we're publishing them, and I have them available again and can find them. That's one of my first examples that fits the pattern.
It's actually to build on that example of the tropes that you expect. It's like trope. One way I look at it is that tropes actually form something like the rules within which you play a game. That the tropes actually define the game that you're playing. Chesterton actually had a really great line, I think it was actually in Orthodoxy, about how an artist doesn't despise his limitations, an artist loves his limitations because they define his work. That the painter is glad that his canvas is square, the sculptor is glad that the marble is colorless. That it's and also that the marble is hard, that you can't just move it, because that's what makes it a marble statue. And so in a kind of similar way, I think tropes define, I know people who say, because I like murder mysteries, I know people say, why do they always have to have so much killing? It's, well, that's the rules of the game.
That's the rules of the game. You can't have a murder mystery if nobody dies. It just doesn't work. Except for the very rare case when you're and that's something that's worth noting, is that you can actually do well within a genre if you subvert parts of the tropes, some of the tropes of your genre. But you have to be careful about that. If you go too far out of the genre, out of the tropes people are expecting, then they don't like it anymore. It's outside of the genre. But if you subvert some of them, like the murder mystery where it turns out the corpse is not actually dead at the end, you can pull that off, as long as you're sticking to the rest of the tropes of the genre, and that comes out. But
there's an even bigger part. You have to be respectful of the tropes, even that you're subverting.
Yes.
So like to take that exact example of where it turns out that the victim didn't die. There's a great Sherlock Holmes. Um, Spoiler alert.
There is one.
I'm not a big believer. It's but the one about the architect, where eventually it turns out that in fact he wasn't killed. But and here's where it's very much respect, even though it's very very early on in murder mysteries, it's respecting the tropes precisely because this itself formed a murder attempt on someone else. He was trying to get a guy hanged for killing him.
Right.
And so it's respectful of the fact that it's a murder mystery, even though he didn't. Well, actually, there was somebody else who was killed, but it was just a tramp, nameless tramp. So, that was almost sort of a technicality. The part where it's really respectful was that yes, he didn't die, but it turned out to be a murder attempt. Right. So it's still in that same sort of exploring the territory of human ingenuity and human evil and good triumphing over evil. Because the problem is when you take it too far into that, you don't have good triumphing over evil anymore, at which point
And you don't necessarily have to even go that far in respecting the genre. For instance, if it turns out the guy is faking his death for some nefarious reason, which again is basically what you're describing, but it doesn't even have to be murder, so long as you respect that the detective had to go through all of the murder mystery phases of figuring out what happened and piecing all the clues together, and then you have your big reveal. If you're following the other tropes of the genre all the way through, you can get away with breaking one, and perhaps more than one.
Again, you have to be careful because, like, if it turns out that the guy didn't die, he just, went on a trip he forgot to tell people about, and so you're just revealing he's healthy in, a different city, and it was just a simple misunderstanding where, like, he wrote a note that he was taking a day trip, and that just, the cat accidentally slipped into the garbage. No one's going, despite the immense brain power of the detective here, if that's your conclusion, no one's gonna, if you're not in a comedy, no one's going to like that.
Well, and that fits to something I made this point in another podcast a while back on a very similar topic. If within the confines of any given genre, the more tropes you break or the bigger you break one, the more you need to stick faithfully to the rest of them. Like, you can get away with a lot if you stick extremely faithfully to the rest of the tropes. But if you just start throwing all the tropes away, then you're just not in your genre anymore. And readers won't know what to do with you if you're not in your genre. And that's a real problem, especially from a marketing point of view. If readers don't know what to do with you and how to classify your book, it's very hard to sell it to another reader. And it's very hard to tell them, what is this book? And that's really what genres do, is they give the reader an idea of what they're getting when they pick up a book, or a movie or a show or whatever. They let you know, okay, this is what I'm getting. Well, I like that kind of thing, so I'll like this, or I don't like that kind of thing, so I'll like that. One of my other personal favorite examples is actually going into the movies. The movie Fight Club. I don't know if you've seen the movie or not.
Yes.
Do you remember any of the trailers for the movie? The marketing campaign for the movie?
No, I never saw those. I saw it. I think
go watch them sometime. If you've seen the movie, go watch the trailers, and you will leave scratching your head, going, "How did they get that trailer from this movie?" And the movie was a big flop, and it's a cult. It has a huge cult following now, but it was a big flop in theaters. And a big part of the reason is because the trailers were just describing a completely different movie than what you actually saw when you went in to see it. And so the people who did go see it were leaving with, like, this is a terrible movie. I hate this movie. It's awful. And, and in my case, I actually really love the movie. I'm a huge, it probably shows you exactly what kind of twisted person I am, that I'm a huge fan of that movie, but I really, really like the film a lot. I thought it was brilliant. I got dragged into the theater by two friends of mine who, they had gone to see it at the Dollar Theater, and they were like, you gotta come see this movie with us. And I was like, guys, I've seen the ads for this movie. It looks terrible. I have no interest in seeing this movie at all. And they're like, trust us, it's nothing like the ads. Like, this is the worst marketing campaign ever. Come see the movie. And my friend Dan, I'll never forget this. He's like, look, I will pay for your ticket to come see this movie. You've got to come see it with us. I was like, okay, if you're paying, I'll come see it. I can't remember if he paid or not. He probably did, actually. But, you know, we went out and we saw the film and I loved it. But if, you know, even with that, even if I had gone in knowing my friend was saying movie, if I had gone in expecting what the trailers showed, I probably still would have not had a great experience in it. But I went in with like, okay, this is not going to be what the trailers sold me. Let's give it a shot, and ended up really enjoying it. But nothing like the trailers, and it flopped hard because of it.
It's interesting, you know, because there are two parts of it. There's the market segmentation part, of course, where, you know, if the only people you bring into the theater to see it are all the wrong sort of people who wouldn't like it, then no one's going to come out and recommend it to anybody. I mean, you know, occasionally you might get I loathed it, but, you know, maybe you wouldn't hate it to a friend.
Yeah.
But, so there's that problem, to be sure. But there's also the problem that people who might like something, if they thought of it in a particular way, might well dislike it if they, you know, thinking about it in a very different manner. So that, you know, if you go in thinking of somebody is supposed to be a hero and he's doing all sorts of terrible stuff and making horrible decisions, you're, at least if you like heroes at all, you're just going to be sort of icked out by it. Like, this is just failure. Whereas if you go in thinking of this as, for example, you know, like the story of somebody essentially, you know, showing, you know, a movie that's about somebody who is, you know, making bad choices and paying for it, then you might think of this in a very, very different light. Or again, actually a great example, Man for All Seasons, which is a fabulous movie. I actually ran into somebody who's telling me, well, the thing is, I couldn't really feel sorry for Sir Thomas More because, you know, in this thing as Chancellor, he himself, you know, is responsible for executions or something like that. Why would you feel sorry for him? He wins. This is the story of his triumph. And it was a really, really clear example to me of if you're watching the story of Saint Thomas More, martyr, and you conclude that his death is him losing and you're supposed to feel sorry for him, you've got this all wrong.
Right.
You're just watching a completely different movie than what's actually on the screen.
I haven't seen the film, but I do know the story of Sir Thomas More, so I can imagine.
The film's well written and well acted, by the way. So if you get a chance,
I should check that out. I think we'd enjoy it.
But anyway, just on the subject of if you think of it as one way, you may take a movie completely differently than if you had thought of it in a different manner.
I can give another personal example of that. That's great. It's a movie I love now. I really, really love it. But the first time I saw it, I was expecting a very different movie. And so the first time I saw it, I left the theaters very disappointed. And, you know, it's just like, it just wasn't that great. It's the movie Office Space. And you're probably in our shared profession, you have to be familiar with that film, I'm sure. And that movie is a classic, right? Yeah. It's an absolute classic. Anybody in our line of work is familiar with it. We've all wanted to take the printer out back and beat the tar out of it. You know, everything about that movie is really classic, but I went into that movie with different expectations. And so the first time I saw it, I was very disappointed. And I don't even remember.
Romantic comedy or something?
No, I mean, I'd seen the trailers. I was expecting a somewhat different plot than what I got out of it, even given the premise. I don't quite remember anymore because it's been longer than I'm going to admit to. But you know, I was really, really disappointed the first time. I don't even remember why I watched it a second time. Somehow I ended up watching it a second time, and I came out a second time and I was like, and well, not came out because I would have watched it on video, but after the second viewing, I got out and I was like, that that's actually pretty good. And I've seen it like a dozen times now, and it just kills me every time. It's really hilarious. But your expectation can absolutely matter. It can have a huge personal effect on the film. And um,
Yeah,
yeah.
what you take as jokes and what you don't is a good example. Actually, a really good example, because I'm a very, very big fan of G.K. Chesterton.
Mhm.
And the first book of his I ever read was Orthodoxy. And the thing is,
Right.
I'd been on a really, really big C.S. Lewis kick. I'd read most of the books C.S. Lewis had written at that point. And by the time I'd read Orthodoxy, this is in high school, this is later high school that I
Mhm.
read Orthodoxy. And after, so again, high school, so a lot less experience, read a ton of C.S. Lewis, like almost back to back, and then read Orthodoxy. And Chesterton's style is very, very different than Lewis's. And
Yes,
it's
it is.
way, yeah, I mean, Lewis intentionally was sort of, dry and very sort of, unambiguous, very, I mean, Lewis worked to make sure that the things he said couldn't really be misinterpreted.
Right.
He tried very hard to make them very generally accessible. And as a result, like it's not that dense. Like Lewis isn't that dense. It's very logical. It's very straightforward. And he tried to make it very straightforward.
Right.
Chesterton isn't. And Chesterton is very humorous. He's also, I mean, that's why there's so much more in every page of Chesterton, because he's just constantly throwing things out, and if you get them, good for you, and if not,
Right.
well, there'll be a lot more in the next sentence. And so, but the problem was, I tried to read Chesterton as if he was Lewis.
Right.
I really didn't like it. I really just didn't. I remember there was something where he mentioned something about Satan fell by the force of gravity. And it's an angel. He doesn't have a body. It really doesn't work. And then this is in contrast to the angels who can fly because they take themselves lightly. And I was reading this as if this was like an argument, and
Right.
and I just didn't like it. And it was like the last chapter of Orthodoxy, because I kept going, and somehow like around the last chapter, I finally got it. Like I finally got the style he was writing in, and then it's become my favorite book that I've read like more than 20 times at this point.
Right.
So it's a really, really, I mean, given that it's my favorite book and he's my favorite author, and I really didn't like it at all for about the first 9/10 of what I read of it, it is a really, really good example of how if coming in with the wrong expectations can change what you're reading for you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it can make a difference. Going back to marketing books as well, and getting them to the right audience. I've found it funny, looking through the reviews of my own works, because every time we get a bad review in, my wife is always all cringing, like, somebody wrote bad things about you, and I'm like, let's go see what they say. And the part that really is amusing to me is there's actually, I'll take my first book, War Demons. It's a first novel, so there's some issues with it that I'm aware of, and worked to correct in subsequent work. But if you look at the reviews, almost all of the reviews, positive and negative, are all talking about the same things. And there's a couple of honest flaws in the book, like this is actually some stuff I should fix in future work. And then there's a lot of stuff that it's really kind of genre tropes, and some people like that because they're coming into the right genre, and some people don't. And it really is a very micro genre too. It's very, very specific. I write urban fantasy and supernatural thrillers for anybody watching who doesn't know. And what we found is that within that genre, you can kind of break it down into books that are, I'll call them masculine and feminine. That's not a perfect descriptor, but it's largely a good generic one. The more masculine books tend to have a male protagonist, and they're written a bit more towards men. a male taste, and the feminine side tends to have a female protagonist, and they're written a bit more towards women. Now, that's not perfect, because obviously you have shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer that I mentioned earlier, which has a huge male audience, right? And it's vice versa. You have a lot of fans who are both, but you can think of them that way, and it gives you it can give you a good idea of how they're written differently. The masculine ones tend to be a bit more action heavy, a bit more into that sort of thing, whereas the feminine ones tend to lean a bit more towards the relationships and drama, and even a bit towards the romance angle. Although there's very definitely a line between what we would call urban fantasy and paranormal romance, even on the feminine side of urban fantasy.
Yeah.
And you can tell from the reviews, mine is more on the masculine side, and you can tell from the reviews, this is somebody who's coming from the feminine side of urban fantasy and doesn't like the book as much, or somebody who's coming from the masculine side and loves it. And I say that, and there are also a number of female fans who have really liked the book, and a number of male fans who less so. Because it's not solely about gender, but you can definitely tell which way their preference leans in the genre from the way they've taken the exact same elements of the book, the exact same things, and written a review that's kind of off. And in one case, we marketed it in one marketing campaign. We marketed a little bit towards readers of thrillers, because you could call it a supernatural thriller as well. And we found people coming in with the expectation of a thriller genre really weren't into the book at all. And we got a couple of negative reviews from that too. And, we learned the lesson of we're marketing the book to the wrong people with this. And so we had to, just kind of alter the expectations of who we were going after. And we've definitely had more success since we've done that. And I don't bring it up for anything talking about marketing so much as it's a very specific example that the expectations of a genre can really matter in terms of how somebody views the work, and down to a very, very tiny level of micro genre, not even just a genre as a whole, but a very specific. Another example that everybody's going to be familiar with immediately is Star Trek versus Star Wars. At one level, they're both science fiction, right? Especially to those of us who grew up in the 80s, when they're basically the only science fiction in the visual world, at least. I mean, we know there were plenty of novels out there and other forms of getting it, but in the film and TV world, it was Star Wars and Star Trek was all they were. So at a high level, sure, they're all space-based science fiction, but they're also very, very different. And
even more so by the time you get to Next Generation.
Yes, and they're, you see that now in some of our mutual friends on Twitter sitting there and arguing about the difference between hard sci-fi and space fantasy or space opera and the like. And it's like, yeah, that's basically the distinction between the two genres. And, whether somebody likes one or not is really a lot dependent on the reader or viewer in this case, and which one they like better is very much just on what genre that person happens to like better.
It is. I mean, and you'll see this too. You'll even see preferences between the individual Star Treks. Like my mother, who could never stand. She watched, of course, the next. Sorry, a bit of background. My mother was a devoted fan of Star Trek, down to the took part in the letter writing campaign to keep it on for another season. She owned every. I grew up with the VHS single episode boxes, where each VHS cassette was one episode. That was like a too thick on one shelf. I grew up watching Star Trek, the original Star Trek,
the good one.
Yes, and unquestionably. And it was interesting, though, seeing, the thing is, I also watched The Next Generation, although it was a very, very different show. Actually,
it is really.
My friend and I, both being big nerds, we'd call each other up after the episode and spend an hour and a half picking apart every mistake they made, plot inconsistency and so on. And it really invited that, because Star Trek The Next Generation, knowing a little bit more now, I might classify it as bureaucrats in space.
To a large degree. It got better about that as the show went on. The early seasons were really, really bad about it.
Even
it did get
later
better.
though, they got a little bit more
it
out
never
there.
got away from it entirely.
No, they really didn't, because because I mean the original one was all about adventure.
Yeah,
and to exploring new worlds, new civilizations, to boldly go where no man had gone before. Whereas the Next Generation was mostly going where other people had gone before, and they were just revisiting places people had been before. This time with more paperwork, and the I mean, I'm not even entirely kidding. Like later seasons of
no, you're
the
not.
Next Generation.
That's funny.
I still remember the environmental episode where warp drive was supposed to be ripping the fabric of space apart and creating warp-free bubbles, and so all interstellar travel was limited to warp 5 unless you had special permission. And then ever after, all this resulted in was somebody would say, "Oh, and we've been authorized to use warp 9." That was the sum total of the effect of that. But it did include specific speed authorizations as part of their episodes. So
I missed that one somehow.
that was like season 6 or early season 7. I'm
not going to make it an effort to go catch it.
I don't recommend it. My mother described it interestingly as like Picard was bloodless, was the way she described it. Like Captain Kirk might well punch or kick his way out of a problem.
Right.
You never thought that Captain Picard would, but then you get to Deep Space Nine, and they, basically, well, the second half where they decided that, hey, Babylon 5 is a great show, and
we need to copy it.
And so they did. So you have the whole interstellar war and the whole war thing. So again, it took on a very different tone. And then you got Voyager with this strange thing that was then buoyed by Seven of Nine's costume, but and then afterwards you got I don't even know what Enterprise was like, because
I watched 3 episodes of Enterprise and shut it off. It couldn't keep me. So.
Yeah, and I don't know it brings up a very interesting question of what genre was it.
I didn't watch enough to give a good answer. I wasn't really into what I was seeing.
But the specifics less so. But what I mean is each one was in a somewhat different genre, even though it in theory had the same core fans. But by the time you get to Enterprise, it definitely was quite different.
Right.
Than the rest. And well, it was canceled after what, 2 seasons, 3?
One of the things I think that's happened as well, to take the other side of the coin with Star Wars, the movies, like the original trilogy, definitely has a distinctly different feel from the prequel trilogy, which also has a distinctly different feel from the sequel trilogy. Or there's only 2 out so far, but we know a 3rd one is coming. And some of the distinction really is that they're really at different subgenres of the overall space opera genre. The prequels definitely brought a bit of the bureaucrats in space into it.
They did. It's a good point. They did.
And the sequels have definitely taken a bit more of a less heroic tone. Obviously, some have even said anti-heroic. I'm not entirely unjustified with that. And you can see in a lot of the fan reaction, like I've seen a lot of folks getting really overblown about how terrible the sequels are, both of them. And I definitely have my own opinions of the movie, but The Last Jedi is the 9th highest grossing film of all time worldwide. It's clearly a lot of people enjoyed the movie enough to go. You don't get that big of a gross by people seeing a movie once. People have seen the movie multiple times to get the gross that high. And so clearly a lot of people really liked the movie. And I think that part of the difference is that it's actually a different subgenre.
No,
and so it's it's actually a movie targeted at different fans. And I don't think it's necessarily even wrong for the people who are the fans of the original to be kind of upset by that, because they're like, hey, this isn't targeted at us anymore.
Yeah, well, I just took the very pragmatic bent of there's no chance I'm going to see this because I know it's not for me and I'd hate it.
And that may well be the case, because
So I mean, it's for
if
someone
your
else.
understanding of the genre is correct, and you've read that correctly, you may not like it.
Yeah, I'm
And
quite confident that I wouldn't. I mean, especially
right,
well, actually, especially a friend of mine who loved the movie, as he was telling me about the parts that, like the best parts that he really loved, I just grew in conviction that I was getting to. I mean, when he told me about his favorite scene, um, I had the conviction. I think I'd be willing to punch people in order to not see this movie. And you know, if I had to like fight my way out of a room in which this is going to be shown, like I think I'd be willing to actually do it rather than politely stay put. Um, the you know, it's unlikely to come up. I don't associate with the sort of people who try to trap me in a room and force me to watch something. So it's a very theoretical statement. But nonetheless, like I concluded, like this really, really is not for me. And it's for other people. And actually, it gets to another another interesting thing, and I think this is something that we'll see to some degree, just a societal change in, because people who grew up in the era that you and I did have a strong sense, I think, at least from when we were younger, of there being such a thing as a fictional canon, and
right,
canon of works. And like one of the things The Last Jedi did was it turned like throughout pretty much all the Star Wars canon. I'm sorry, Force Awakens throughout,
right.
or the sequels throughout all the Star Wars canon. At which point it's not canon, but I think a bigger thing is, going forward for corporate things, not individual authors, there isn't a canon. There isn't really such thing as a canon anymore. Like there was for a while when, comic books would respect the things that people had written, or especially the same authors 10 years ago had written. We had a sense that there would be this sort of canon, but I think we're actually a lot closer to what the ancient Greek myths were like. Because, of course, if you go to this city, they'll tell you this story about Athena. If you go to that city, they'll tell you that story about Athena. They may well be contradictory stories. You can hear this story about Heracles here, or that story about Heracles there. Over here, they didn't even believe Heracles was ever a man. And so it was a sort of a, well, there's no concept of canon across ancient Greece. Is pick which one you like. And I kind of think that, for things like Spider-Man, there are so many takes on Spider-Man at this point that are all contradictory to each other, that it's a take which one you like. But this is something I think will change too, because I still have that feeling of and I know people to whom that concept of canon is important. Like this is canon if you want it to be. I mean,
So I think that's a really interesting insight, but I'm going to tweak it a little bit, because I think that the segment of the population that ever cared about a canon was smaller than it seemed. Um, the and
well, all the
honestly,
nerds that went to my high school, at least.
it's
It's a good time.
it's probably nerds who cared about canon. um, where did it start? The expectation of there being a canon. Where did it come from in fiction? It all came from science fiction and fantasy communities, really. Superhero communities as well, which you could easily consider as a subset of science fiction and fantasy.
I noticed people
Uh,
do, having written a superhero novel. Everyone was calling it science fiction. I was shocked by this, and
well,
eventually
and
discovered that's where people put it.
Amazon categorizes superheroes underneath one of those two. I don't even remember which. And it's not as, outside of comic books, it's not as big a genre on its own. Um, but those are, you see it in the comic book world, where they started having, go look at the early days of comic books, and there's no continuity at all. Like they're telling a story, and they're like, okay, we've had a story here, boom, boom. Now in this issue over here, we're going to tell a story that is completely unrelated to it and may contradict what we wrote in this other story. and what's going on. And it's really in the 70s and into the 80s when continuity in comic books became a thing. And then obviously you have things like novel worlds with big science fiction and fantasy writers where they started to figure out that they could sell more books if they had multiple books or multiple series even that take place with the same set of characters or in the same world and everything. And in the 90s, that started to spread into television. But even in television, where did it come from first? The first one in American television was Babylon 5. And
Babylon 5.
And
it
then
redefined television.
And then you had series where it spread next. The next ones that it spread to were shows like Buffy and its successor Angel, and a handful of other shows that kind of picked up on the same kind of thing. It's geek culture that did it.
No, I suspect, by the way,
how much do people outside of that culture care? And I'm not sure that the answer
doesn't look like much.
I don't think the answer is much. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
Oh no, actually, I was more jumping in anyway. But no, I mean, empirically, yeah, I don't think people generally do. I do think there may be another element too, because there are a number of things. In fact, the two big examples that you used, one of the things that's kind of curious about them is they had a gap. Star Trek was in the 1960s,
right?
Star Wars in the 70s into the early 80s, and then there was a bit of a fallow period in there, in which it was only the nerds and geeks who were keeping this alive in memory to some degree, who did help to bridge that gap. There's enough money there, there's enough interest, that even though nerds and geeks are a small subset of the population, that nonetheless they had enough money to sort of bridge this gap and bring things back until it took on a more popular form. But there is an element of things being canon simply in them not being written right now. Because anything that's in the past is kind of safely in the past. It's not changing. And so that probably actually helped to contribute, and also, of course, need nerds and geeks just with our propensity to learn large numbers of facts. And
I was about to say
this. Them better.
I was about to say myself, and I mean it lovingly, not disparagingly at all, but what do science fiction and fantasy nerds and geeks all have in common? There's a very large number of people with Asperger's in that group who are autistically memorizing everything there is to know about these shows and getting very upset when you change it. And I mean that very lovingly, because that's a term that describes quite a bit of my friends and family and
even more
people that I love. And I've been guilty of the same myself in some of these shows, so I'm not trying to disparage anybody, but honest to God, outside of the Spurgs, nobody cares. And, a great counterexample to it and showing is James Bond. There's no canon of James Bond. There has never been a canon of James Bond. How many different actors have played James Bond now? I don't even remember. At least half a dozen. None of the films really have much relationship to each other at all, except that, like you said about the Greek myths, this is our story about James Bond, and we'll go on. And the general public, those movies make good money every time one comes out. The general public just doesn't care.
Well, and if you're upfront about having zero continuity, whatever, even the people who like canon will simply accept. And this actually gets back to just the general topic. If you're really upfront, if you're like a Simpsons episode where there's no continuity, and they technically have like a slightly selective continuity, but all the same, like if you're really, really upfront about the fact that there's no continuity, whatever, people just, okay, fine, there's no continuity. They're all individual stories. But yeah, there's one other thing, by the way, because it's not just, I mean, it is true that people who are on the spectrum, the higher function on the spectrum can get very picky about detail. But there's also another fraction of nerd culture, which is simply people with very good memories.
Yes.
And which is one reason why, I see nerds often go into technology, anything programming, engineering, all those things require extremely good memories in order to be able to do them. And, memories both, they can remember a lot and can recall an awful lot on relatively small amounts of detail and very rapidly and
Right.
so on. And so that too, that's where,
Hmm.
even if you're not on the spectrum, it can simply, if you have a really good memory and someone else has a really good memory, one version of one version of wrestling with each other is just seeing whose memory is better, where you're both sharpening it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's got almost a similar thing in terms of strengthening each other by just seeing who can pin the other person to the ground. Well, seeing who can out remember the other person is exercising a skill that especially if you've already got it and you develop it, and, especially if your career is going to go in that direction, it's one more thing. So it also plays into that too.
Absolutely.
But people with really good memories remember all the things that you're contradicting.
Absolutely. I don't disagree with a word of that. And I make my comments, like I said, about the Asperger's and autistic stuff very lovingly and overgeneralization. I'm aware of
Oh
that.
yeah, yeah.
Um, the other thing that I think has happened very much, your point about if you accept that there's no canon, you go in and you're fine. And I think that part of what's happened is that geek culture has gone mainstream. And the mainstream audiences don't care about the canon. But the geeks who were the core original audience do care about the canon. And some portion of them are actually autistic, getting upset about it from an autistic standpoint of being unable to cope. And some other portion are not actually autistic, but are just, well, hey, wait, you took my fandom and ruined it by getting rid of all of our canon. And they're not necessarily wrong to be upset about that, but also from the point of view of the content producer looks at it and was like 80% of my money is coming from people outside your little fan group, and they don't care. and
Yeah.
so it's the corporatization of everything again, turning into that. But
Well, there's
I do
actually an
think,
even more interesting point there. I think actually, forgive the interruption, but
sure,
when you talk about mainstream audiences don't care, in fact, it can often be a lot more pronounced than that. That is, that being being respectful of previous canon can actually be detrimental to mainstream audiences.
it can
Um,
be.
for several, I mean, there's the obvious of you have to assume, either you go over it at extreme detail, or you assume that people know it. Either one of those things is
Right.
going to have real downsides for people who don't know it. But the other thing is, um, stories that really work in continuity, it's incredibly, incredibly hard to make them also work entirely independently.
Yes.
And so if you don't make them work entirely independently, they become much more complex, which people can handle, especially if you are part of that subset who happens to have a really good memory.
Yes.
You can handle that fairly well. This is really, really being driven home to me, actually, as I'm reading Encyclopedia Brown stories with my 8-year-old son. And each story is about 6 pages long. And it's funny, like in the back of my head, I can hear the 16-year-old who's looking at this and saying, like, this is stupid. It's so predictable. You can spot the clues like a mile away. But the thing is, for an 8-year-old, if you put, this is just about the right size. This is what an 8-year-old can cope with. This is
Right.
where an 8-year-old can occasionally, every once in a great while, he figures it out. Most of the time, he doesn't. And okay, I'm his father, but he's a smart kid, especially verbally, um, but also mathematically. And at 8 years old, this is around what he can cope with. If this was better from the perspective of an adult, it couldn't even be interesting to him because there would be so much that he just didn't have references for, wasn't used to holding. He couldn't do it.
It's funny that you mentioned that particular series because I just recommended that my wife should pick it up for our 8-year-old, for something
Oh, it's
to go
great.
through. I read a ton of them when I was that age myself, and really really enjoyed them. I haven't looked at one since, so I would imagine I would probably look at it now, going like, "Holy!" wow, these are, with exactly what you said. But part of my recollection of what was so great about those books at that age was that the books actually were meant to be somewhat educational, and not just written in a way where an 8-year-old wouldn't pick up the mystery, but written in a way where the 8-year-old wouldn't know what they needed to know to pick up the mystery, and getting the big reveal at the end would actually teach them something.
Yeah.
That
No,
was
it's certainly true.
That was but do it in a way that was highly entertaining, not just hey,
Oh
let's
yeah,
learn
well,
some
they're
new.
written with great style, and I mean, my son, they've got, there's so many of them. There's um oh, there's one, like he's Bugs Meany was like a crooked pair of dentures, always trying to get even, and they have so many of these great turns of phrases. And the thing is, as a writer and a publisher, you're going to recognize a lot of the like background of how these things were designed, which is
Right.
interesting, although it can be a trap where you can fail to appreciate them. But I mean, it's something like my son loves them, and we take turns reading them to each other. Where like I do more of the reading to him, but like sometimes like if I'm doing something with my hands, like making food or something, he'll read them to me. That's how into them he is, and but the thing is, they even have like a fairly like a pretty set structure to them. They don't vary very
They
much.
did. I recall that.
And the thing is, at his age though, he hasn't seen thousands upon thousands of story structures to instantly recognize plot elements where you really need to vary it up to make this something
Right.
new. And so if you do that, if you make it that weird, he doesn't have patterns. He doesn't have enough of a base of patterns in order to even find it intelligible. It gets even more pronounced, I think, as an illustration of the general principle. If you look at stuff that's designed for like 3-year-olds,
Mm-hmm.
because man, is that formulaic. But that's why the 3-year-old can even appreciate it a little bit.
Yeah.
If it didn't have that incredibly rigid structure, the 3-year-old would be utterly lost every episode instead of simply the first few.
As you can probably imagine, with 4 children under the age of 8 in my house, I've watched rather a lot of children's television in the last 8 years. And some of it is very, very, very formulaic. And what's interesting is how well some of the shows can do about being very interesting for adults, even when they're that formulaic, and how other shows completely fail.
Oh yes.
And the authors out there who can make it that formulaic and still appeal to the adults, my hat's off to you, because that's not an easy job. I'll give the quick plug to one of my actual personal favorite children's shows, Phineas and Ferb. You're making a quizzical face, like you may not have seen that one.
I've heard the name. I don't think I'm trying to remember if I've ever seen it or not. I've certainly heard of it.
How old are your children?
8, 6, and 2.
8, 6, and 2. They would probably still enjoy it, especially the younger one, the 6-year-old. The 2-year-old's probably a little too young for the show, but it's on Netflix now.
I'll check that out.
I highly recommend it. It's one of my personal favorite children's shows, and it's extremely formulaic. Like, but one of the things that gets really fun is the adult watching it, and the kids actually enjoy this too, is that by the end of the show's run, they were actually starting to make fun of the formula as well. And just had a ton of jokes in the show that were all about picking at how formulaic it was, and running with it, and a little bit of meta humor there and everything. But it's I would recommend that one. But a whole ton of other stuff we've watched seen our kids watch. It's all very formulaic,
which is critical to the children being able to appreciate it.
They're not ready to handle something else, and I'm going to extend the metaphor further as well, which is that even adults, if you present them with a work of fiction that's too far outside of a structure that they're familiar with, they don't know how to process it. and they typically won't enjoy it. They'll look at it and be like, well, what's this? I don't know what to do with it. And it may be something that's in fact quite good, but they may not have the framework to wrap their brain around it and get a handle on it. And so you have to be very, very careful about that as a writer, if you want to make money. You can get into the literary crowd where they're all like, I want to do something new and original and completely different. Like, okay, you can do that. And
it's relatively easy.
That
I mean, if you don't have the requirement of anyone liking it, that's easy.
Yeah. But if you want to actually make money as a writer, you can't do that because your audience of people who can actually understand it will be too small to support your work. And you have to keep that in mind as you go.
Well, and this relates to the what we were talking about before about if something moves into the mainstream, you have to, if you want it to succeed there, you have to make it something that people who don't have a large background can appreciate, which means that you have to keep it to basically much simpler, or at least structures that are so universal that everyone's going to think of them as simple, whether or not they in fact actually are. Which, of course, the people who really, really love a distinct subgenre are going to be very iffy on, simply because it feels way too simple to them, because it's such a structure they're so incredibly familiar with and doesn't have really any novelty to them. The other thing, too, is that the more you get into a subgenre, the more complex you can make something with relatively little effort, because with small things you can reference like 45 different books, historically speaking,
right?
With one simple little thing. I think actually you may have talked about this in a previous conversation. If you describe somebody as the as the like third sub-lieutenant in the evil of the execution squad in the evil empire, you just referenced a few dozen works of literature at least.
Well, to a reader of the right subgenre, you've actually just given them an incredible amount of information.
Yeah.
Just that statement. You've said there is an evil empire. They've got an army. They've got a rank structure, and you've given some hint about what that rank structure looks like. You've given some hint about your character's background, given the fact that he's a part of this military rank structure.
Also, where he is in his life trajectory, because he's a third, not a first.
Right. And you've conveyed a lot of information with very little words, but only to the person who understands that, who is who, if you operate within that genre, the person who does gets that. You can have that sort of thing backfire on you really badly, though. One of my beta readers for War Demons, not War Demons. Was it War Demons? It was War Demons. One of my beta readers for War Demons complained at me because in one of the scenes in there, I was describing a dragon, and I just interspersed another word for it. I think I used the word worm, YWRM, which anybody who reads a lot of fantasy, that's just not a problem. Like they understand that, right?
Yeah.
But that threw her through a loop. She's like, "What's a worm? Are you talking about something different here? Like, what's going on?" And I'm, so you can run into problems with people who don't know your genre, and using the similar kind of term. You throw out, the description of your third lieutenant there, and if you've got somebody who has no understanding of a military rank whatsoever, they're just hearing a bunch of random military talk. That's what they hear, and that's literally all they understand it as is military talk. It doesn't, it's the way that your average normal person listens to technobabble from Star Trek.
Well, everyone listened to technobabble. The technobabble was literally babble in many cases, but yes. No. I know what you mean. Actually, a really, really good metaphor for this, something my wife and I stumbled on. There's this song that she happened to have on her playlist that was like half in French and half in English.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is, it wasn't like alternate verses; it was kind of intermixed.
Right.
And she studied French in high school, and she likes French, so she really enjoyed singing this. And then at one point, she paused and said, this is probably what, like you listening to this song is probably what our 3-year-old, number of years back, like our 3-year-old listening to us speak English sounds like.
Yeah, probably.
Because about, at least half the words in here are just nonsense. And so you pick out a few words and try to guess at what the sentence means with the few words you actually do recognize. And of course, I mean, that can go massive. I'll never forget the time when I asked him, I think it was like a 2.5-year, this is like, it was two to three, something in that range. And I asked him, like, he did something and he hit his mother. He said, "Did you hit your mom on purpose?" And he said, "Yes." And it was, launching into, "You shouldn't hit people." And then it dawned on me, wait a minute. He's like 2.5. Do you know what on purpose means? No.
I have these kinds of discussions with my 4-year-old quite a lot, and sometimes the older children, they're like saying something, and I'm like, you don't know what that means, do you? Accidental on purpose is one with my 4-year-old in particular that we've had to go through.
But if you think about it from a child's perspective, if they had to stop and ask what every word they don't know means, you'd never get a sentence out.
No.
I mean, because hell, every time you define something, you'd be using words they don't know. You just spend forever in this recursive loop, constantly, never getting anything even finished defining. So they just have to try to guess. And it's, though at a, much higher level, getting far, far, far more of it, a person who isn't from a genre is in a similar position. You get some of it, you're trying to guess at the pieces in between, but there's a lot that's missing, and consequently a lot you're going to miss.
Right. I've seen this in the writing community as very important as well, and I'm going to stay a little bit vague because, I'm going to be talking.
You want the maximum number of people to think you're talking about them?
But yeah, I'm gonna stay a little bit vague on purpose on this one. But a friend of mine who has written this series of books that have sold okay, but not amazing. And they're quite good. I've actually read them all and I enjoy them. But one of the reasons I think they've been a little bit less commercially successful than they could have been is he operates within one specific subgenre, and it fits pretty well within that subgenre, except that he also created his own terminology for almost everything within his series. And so people who are familiar with that subgenre, I had this trouble reading it, especially at the beginning. As I kind of got going, I kind of got the hang of it. But you're reading an awful lot of terminology that is gobbledygook. It's not gobbledygook. It actually means stuff within his book. But when you're first reading it, you don't understand it at all. It's like, I have no idea what's happening here. I don't understand any of these words. What does this word mean? What does that word mean? And I've actually seen this happen multiple times in multiple subgenres from different authors. I have one in mind at the moment, but I have seen multiple cases of it. And there is a set of readers out there, hardcore geek readers, who actually really enjoy that kind of thing and will make the effort to read it. But that is not the large masses of audiences who will do that. And so it's not something I would say to actually ding his books from a quality standpoint, but from a commercial standpoint, it has definitely cost him in my opinion. I think it has. And
you're lacking a controller. It's always hard to.
Right. And I think it's something where the same books could have actually done quite a bit better commercially had he just changed that one thing. Like literally that one thing, just used terminology that his readers would have been more familiar with. I think a lot more people would have continued reading rather than, putting the book down. And, it's the kind of thing that's an easy mistake to make when you're fairly new to the business.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm in no way trying to actually criticize him for it. Believe me, I've made plenty of my own mistakes on my early works. Um, Only bringing it up because it's pertinent to the conversation of the things that your readers need enough to be able to follow what's going on, and they need enough to be able to follow what's going on easily enough to enjoy it. If it's too much work, they don't enjoy it anymore. And where that threshold is varies from reader to reader, but if you're trying to make lots and lots of money at it, you need to actually go to a common enough denominator that lots and lots of people can read it.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. It's one of those things. You can always find some subgenre, like a smaller niche in which they're so familiar with all of the things that this is, at the right amount of work to just be really fun to get into.
Right.
Whereas for somebody who's got less of the requisite background, it's way too much work.
Exactly. And, it is what it is. And it depends on what you're going for as a writer. If that's just what you want to hit and what you want to target, great. You can do that. But also the fact is that if you've got that and that's what you've done with your work, you need to the best of your ability, you need to market it towards the people who are going to like that as well.
Yeah.
And that's where you'll succeed. Whereas if you try to market it to the masses who aren't ready for that, you're just not going to succeed with that group. And
bonus points if you can get a movie made about it, and then lots of people are willing to pick it up because they like the movie so much. They'll, like A Clockwork Orange,
right,
with all the Russian terminology, they're willing to slog through it because the movie was so great, so they're sure that there's something in the book.
I hated that movie, so I don't see it, but that's me.
I didn't think it was good myself, but lots of people did.
Lots of people evidently did. I am not
a single one of them who seemed healthy to me back in high school, but in any event, there can be good and bad reasons to like something. I really enjoyed that scene where where the innocent person was brutally murdered. There are people who will say that was their favorite scene. It was really great. Kind of go okay, tastes vary. De gustibus non disputandum est, but you know what? I don't think this is a matter of taste. I think this isn't. I think this is something else going on here. So anyway, but there's probably something in A Clockwork Orange I missed.
So interestingly, on a bit of a topic shift, we're talking about tropes again. The other thing that's very interesting is parody. And in order for a parody to succeed, it typically also needs to be a very good example of whatever it is that it's parodying. And that usually requires that a parody of something must actually follow all of the tropes of the genre that it's parodying.
Although without the supporting material to make it believable. Which
yes,
is what gives you the time to put it in a different...
Or the flip side is to take all the tropes and ratchet them up to the absurd extreme, which often is where the humor comes from in the parody.
It is. I still think Galaxy Quest is a good example, I think.
Galaxy Quest is a great example. It's one of the perfect parodies. And I know a number of people who will actually tell you it's their favorite Star Trek film.
It's my second favorite.
Or some such, where they'll say something like that. And because it did such a good job of copying all the tropes of a Star Trek film.
They got them, but if you look at them, they were always, whereas something that's being played straight always puts in, because realistic fiction is a relatively modern thing. It's like 300 years old, thereabouts. The invention, as C.S. Lewis put it, in a different context, the invention of a relevant detail in order to lend verisimilitude is a relatively new phenomenon. And there weren't that many novels in the first 100 some odd years of novels there too. And it's really starts picking up in the 1800s. That's when there's really sort of an explosion of novels. So it's not that old an art form, but things that are seriously in that genre do make a point of putting in the various irrelevant detail in order to help lend verisimilitude to the tropes
Right.
that they're doing. Whereas if you look in Galaxy Quest, they don't do that. They don't put in any of that verisimilitude. They just hit you with these things really hard. You know, the guy who comes up and just says, hey, you know, it took me 3 years to learn to lay on the bed of spikes, but once I was able to, I found truth, or the 3 spikes, I think it was, or something like that. But once I did, I found inner peace. You know, with no introduction to the culture, no introduction to what the 3 spikes are, you know, none of that. The by Grabthar's hammer, you've never heard of Grabthar before, what his hammer does, or what he uses it for, who it is who likes his hammer. They hit you with those things, and that's where the trope, without any of that supporting relevant detail, becomes, it's a perfect example of the trope. And stripped of all that detail, it's just the trope bare, so you get to really sort of enjoy that. But that's also what gives them the space to build up those actors as like actual actors. You know, they
Right.
throw in there all that time and effort to build them up as actual actors who are in this really weird situation.
The other way you can approach it with parody is from one of my other personal favorite parodies. Galaxy Quest is one. Hot Fuzz is another of mine. You're
What's
making a funny face.
parody of?
You should go watch Hot Fuzz. Drop whatever else you're doing this weekend and go watch Hot Fuzz. It's by the guys who did Shaun of the Dead. If you're familiar with that. What's his name? He plays Scotty in the new Star Trek.
I haven't seen it.
Simon Pegg and Nick Frost. And it's basically a parody of the buddy cop style action movie.
Okay, I was guessing from the name.
And it is also one of the best buddy cop action movies I've ever seen. It is simultaneously a parody of one and one of the best I've ever seen. It's a phenomenally great. If you like that kind of film at all, it's phenomenally great.
Like Lethal
it
Weapon.
follows their tagline when they advertised it. Their tagline was "From the guys who have watched every action movie ever," and they followed the tropes of the action movie to a T, to perfection. But they also made them all, they elevated them to absurdity. So rather than not giving you the detail that made it work, they just elevated it straight up to the just top level of absurdity for every trope, while playing it all straight the whole way through. It's you kind of have to see it just to see. It's just a masterpiece of a well-constructed film for what it's trying to do.
Have you seen what do you call it? Not True Lies, Last Action Hero.
Yes. Not a very popular film, but I actually rather liked it.
It is? I thought it,
I'm the oddball out. Everybody else hates that film. I actually kind of enjoyed it.
I really liked it, and I thought it actually was not by no means perfect, but that it was still it was a good action movie, reasonably in its genre, and a parody of action movies at the same time.
Yeah.
Although it had a really interesting development history. Because the original... Oh, sorry.
It did, yeah, a bit. Go ahead.
I was going to say, the original writers hated the action genre and were trying to destroy it. And so that was the original script, and then it got punched up by several people. I think even Shane Black, who was like the inventor of the action movie, I think he was involved in it. But yeah, it got punched up by heavily rewritten by a bunch of people who didn't hate the genre, and as a result, made it a movie that you can actually watch if you like action movies. So that was a really curious example of where is massively changed along the way, because it started off not as really so much a parody, but as like it was. I don't know, what would you call a genre where it's like a parody but from people who want to urinate on the genre?
I don't know, because that doesn't typically work well as a parody. Like,
no,
I'm of the opinion that in order to do a parody that succeeds, you have to actually like whatever it is you're parodying.
Oh, I think you're 100% correct. This has been done, and there should be a name for it.
Yeah,
the hate parody.
you're
or
right. It
something.
is. It's a not uncommon thing, actually. I mean, there's several of them, and they're usually not very good. Like, I actually enjoy parodies, especially parodies of things that I like, um, but not. I don't enjoy them when they're done by people who don't like what they're parodying, even if it's something that I also don't like. Like, you've got to do it well, um, and I don't know. I think that movie is a great example, though, of people not liking something if they're going in with the wrong expectations. And I think
Mm.
that even though it's part of what I personally love about the film, I think that casting Arnold Schwarzenegger in it is probably why so many people don't like the film, because they probably went in expecting it to be an Arnold film.
Mm. I can
And
see that. Yeah.
it kind of is, but it's also very much a parody of an Arnold film, obviously.
Yeah.
And a pretty fair number of people probably ended up not liking the film explicitly because of that. And
Well, especially because he had a large portion of the parodic elements.
he
I mean,
did.
he did a lot more acting than he does in a typical Arnold film.
And that's actually one of the reasons I really enjoy the film, because I have a personal soft spot for people who are that huge, who are able to not take themselves too seriously. Um, I'm a gigantic fan of The Rock, even though I'm not necessarily a fan of a lot of his movies. I really like him personally because he just doesn't take himself too seriously. I mean, the man is crazy wealthy, has crazy command of the box office whenever he's in a film, and he just doesn't act like that guy. You know, he pokes fun at himself all the time in his films, and I think a lot of that comes from his WWE background, actually, of just understanding that it's all a game like that. And I enjoy it because, you know, I just enjoy his ability to just laugh at himself, because it's something so many people in Hollywood seem terminally unable to do these days. And it's
Yeah.
and I enjoyed that a lot about Last Action Hero. Is Arnold was well aware of how much the tropes of his genre, the very very specific sub micro genre of Arnold films, of how tropish and predictable they actually are, and and because that's a genre all of its own.
Yeah.
Arnold films is a genre all of its own that nobody else other than Arnold will ever be able to do. Um, and but he understood how, as much as many of us are and were huge fans of that genre, and I still am, I still love the old classic Arnold films. There's definitely a point at which they're ridiculous as well.
Yeah. They're
Seriously
very,
ridiculous.
very specific sort of fantasy.
They
They're
are.
very, very incredibly pinpoint fantasy. But, you know, but at the same time, one of the things that's kind of curious is that Last Action Hero had, in the street portion of it, it was, well, it almost could fit the urban fantasy. I mean,
Yeah.
no, it's not solely an urban fantasy, but like the part where there's actually the magic ticket that brings you to a different world that operates
Yeah.
in parallel to our own, like that part, interestingly, is the straight part of the film.
Right.
It's one of the main straight parts, and so it makes sense that somebody who goes into it looking for an Arnold film, in which the fantastical element is that Arnold Schwarzenegger is in fact taller and stronger than any human being really can be, and that sort of
Right.
height and strength can really accomplish that much more. In those sorts of circumstances, like that's the part of the fantasy that you know, in an Arnold film that you know, one really wants. And the more plausible in a sense in Terminator, but the at the same time, like magic tickets, and you know, there's one scene I really remember was when he's talking with the kid, you know, as the hero, the movie hero, talking with the kid, saying, and he's talking about, like, you know, my ex-wife doesn't call me. I pay someone to do this just so that the guys at the station don't think I'm completely alone. I've every time I walk into my apartment, I have to shoot the window because there's always a ninja hiding in it. I live completely alone because there's always a ninja hiding in my closet. This isn't a great life. In fact, this is painful, and it's weird for an Arnold film. I mean, to talk about the downsides of being a hero.
That's probably another part of the reason that I think you just hit on a lot of the reason it doesn't have the appeal to the Arnold fans and why it was a flop, because two particular things simultaneously. One, it's really a different genre film almost by being that not quite urban fantasy thing. There's an old adage. Obviously, it's not universally true because Marvel Comics does this all the time. But the adage is, if you have one kind of magic in your world, don't add a second kind. So, for instance, if you have straight up actual supernatural magic in your world, don't add technological magic as well. It's too much of a leap of disbelief for somebody to take. Okay.
Marvel gets around to broken every single type of magic altogether.
The Avengers made a boatload of money, so obviously you can break this rule every now and then. But there's definitely an element of truth to that. So as you pointed out, the typical Arnold fantasy is the big, strong, alpha male, hulking guy magic. But when you start introducing magic tickets and moving to alternate worlds, like, you're running into a kind of a different genre. Now, you can get away with that in a lot of cases because obviously Arnold films often do, like The Terminator, which is very much a sci-fi movie, or The Predator, which introduces the alien predator as well. So Arnold was somewhat known for that. But I think what they also hit on is what you noticed as well, which is they're actually deconstructing, not just parodying, but also deconstructing the Arnold fantasy as well in that. And
although I will note they did it in a respectful way.
I thought they did as well. Like, like I said, I enjoyed the film. It was a commercial flop when it came out, and it was widely panned, but I've always liked it since the first time I saw it, which actually was quite a bit after it came out. I missed it when it came out.
Though, interestingly, we both like fantasy.
Yeah, that could be it.
So, I mean, I think it would make sense if for the two of us, you throw in magic tickets and alternate worlds, and cool. That's
right.
fine.
Like, I actually never really thought about that the way you're pointing it out, because it was something I never had any trouble accepting, but I could see how Arnold fans actually might. The broader set of Arnold fans.
Well, and again, too, like the deconstruction of it. What's interesting about the deconstruction of the Arnold character is that it's in service of building him up to a hero's quest, essentially.
It is. It is. I really love that he goes through like the part that I really remember from the film, the scene that sticks with me years and years later. I haven't seen it in a very long time. The part that I remember is when he comes out of the movie and he's in the real world and he's chasing the guy, and I don't even remember why, but there's the scene where he goes up to the car and he just punches through the window.
Oh yeah, that his hand hurts.
And he's just like, that hurts. Like, this is such a foreign thing to him. Like, it hurts. And as you say, it builds him up to the end where he actually becomes a hero because he has to actually deal with pain and overcome that in order to defeat the villain, which
and success not being guaranteed.
Right. And which I actually really loved that about the film. Like, I thought that was something showing a character being truly, in my opinion, you're not truly heroic unless you have to overcome adversity. And showing him do that, it's funny because it also reflects one of my favorite lines from Princess of Mars, the first John Carter book by Edgar Rice Burroughs, when the main character is running through. It's early on in the book, and he's running through trying to get away from some soldiers before he gets sent to Mars, and he's running through in his head, and he's like, "Is this what fear feels like? I have a lot more sympathy for cowards now."
wonderful line.
It's a wonderful line. It's a wonderful book. I actually I greatly love it. But it's a you know, you can't actually be brave if you don't feel fear, right? And you can't actually be heroic if you don't have to fight some kind of adversity and have some actual difficulty in what you're doing. And that was really the point. Last Action Hero that's really the point of the film, honestly, or at least part of what I took from it was that, you know, these action movies are so over the top, the heroes not really, you know, or at least from a audience perspective where we know he's going to win. It's like, yeah, you're not facing these as real adversity and everything. And you're not really suffering the pain you would actually deal with if you had any of these things, you know.
Yeah.
And then it
Well,
takes
also,
that character, but puts him in a real situation and forces him to actually overcome the adversity. And he does. And I personally liked that. I enjoyed it.
yeah, well, I mean, because the classic Arnold movie is much more of a. I mean, Terminator is an exception because he's the villain, but Terminator 2 is, you know,
Mhm.
kind of back to normal. As you said, it's the alpha male. I mean, that has a pretty that comes with lots of baggage. That phrase.
Yeah.
But the thing is, it's, you know, the main fantasy is about how, because Arnold always starts off there. There's no training scene in an Arnold film. There's no, you know,
Except
he
for
starts
Conan.
off with all his abilities. And this is showing how these abilities actually work, that they
Right.
actually succeed, that the abilities accomplish something. I mean, in ridiculously unrealistic ways, because in real life, if you just pick somebody up and like threaten to kill them in a school, they don't do what you want and everything's fine. They you know, bring you up on
Yeah.
assault charges. The or, you know, get you fired or something like that. But they use the bureaucratic structure to take advantage. So that, you know, there's the fantasy element, but it's about the I mean, the Arnold film at its core, you know, is about that strength is valuable, that strength
Right.
actually does accomplish something. And so that's why he starts off with the strength and then accomplishes something with it. I mean, that's the sort of the core. I mean,
Yeah.
what's great about seeing, you know, this giant muscle bound guy who is, well, not muscle bound, but, you know, this giant, you know, He-Man walk through and pick up the villains and throw them, is the idea that strength actually can accomplish something other than helping somebody carry a piano when they're moving. And so I mean, it's really very, very different than a hero's quest. A hero's quest is a radically different sort of story. Um, you know, so it's a very, very different aspect of reality that the two are really trying to address,
Right.
I think. So I mean, that really does, you know, put them in two different genres. Although with regard to the hero, I think there are two elements to the hero story, and the second one, the one you identified, absolutely, the need to overcome adversity, the need to overcome, you know, the personal risk, the sacrifice, essentially, that's involved. Um, but the other element too is that there has to be an element of it being gratuitous. Um, there's to say, in addition to sacrifice, there has to be generosity.
Right.
Um, and this is actually where this is someplace I criticize modern movies heavily, because modern movies tend to be, I think, written in terms of story beats, and story beats will be things like, you know, the hero is, you know, not sure, the hero decides to do something, and you know, so I in a very cynical way summarize modern movies, the modern hero, as, you know, the main character is trying to decide whether he's going to be completely worthless as he wants to be, or whether essentially society is going to be able to talk him into only being mostly worthless. Um, and but it has the same story beats as a heroic story. But the thing is, it's almost invariably, it talks him into it in that, like, if you don't do this, then lots of people are going to suffer. So you have to do this because you're the one. Only you can do this.
Right.
But that's not heroic. If you're the only person who can save people, you simply have a moral obligation. The hero's quest, the hero's story, is one in which you don't even know if people really need you, but you're going to help them anyway. I mean, you don't even know, are you going to be able to succeed?
Right.
Is there some way that this could work out even if you don't do it? Well, you see some way you can help, so you're going to go help, even if maybe somebody else might come along and help, you know, might have come along and help anyway. You see an opportunity, so you take this opportunity to do something that you don't have to do. And that's an integral, as much, now you have to sacrifice, you have to be in danger, otherwise it's not heroic. But if there isn't that element of it being gratuitous, if there isn't an element of you going beyond bare necessity, it's also not heroic.
I can't remember where, but I remember seeing you make that argument before somewhere, and finding it to be a very valuable insight. Actually, I think there's something to that, and obviously, I wasn't trying to imply that danger and sacrifice is
Oh no, no,
the
I
only
didn't
thing
mean
that
to
makes
use this.
something heroic. I believe it's a necessary part. I agree with pretty much everything you said there, and it's something I hadn't thought about a whole lot until I'd seen you make that point. And I do think it's very valuable. The fact that I do think it's important for the hero to actually choose to be a hero, not to be forced into it. I think it's a valuable thing. And to a sense, that almost comes down to a free will issue, right? I mean, can you actually be good if you don't have any choice? And I've always believed the answer to that is no. And you can't be evil either if you have no choice. Being good and evil requires a choice. If you have no choice, there's you as an actor at least are not making a moral decision if you honestly have no choice. And
Yeah.
so that's something I've definitely believed for a long time. um
Well, there's a distinction we need to make though, because like for example, in being a parent, if you don't take care of your child is going to suffer horribly.
right,
But you can do it. I mean, it is a choice because plenty of
right.
people do, in fact. So you're good. You have the free will aspect and make the choice as a parent to take care of your children. So that does have the moral quality, even though there's the sense in which, well, I mean, how could I do otherwise? Because they'd suffer
Right.
horribly. But you can actually walk away from it. Um, the because what I'm thinking of is a slightly different thing. It may even be a somewhat um, the thing I'm thinking of may be a somewhat I don't want to say specifically Christian thing because I haven't thought about that enough, but it's at least something that's extremely consonant with Christianity in the idea of that heroic virtue is something in which you go beyond necessity. You go
Right.
beyond simply the minimum into providing even more than is necessary.
Hmm.
So it's not merely fulfilling your duty, but going beyond your duty. Because if
Right.
you fulfill your duty, you're good. Because if you shirk on your duty, you're bad. But if you rise above your duty and do even more than your duty requires, that's when you become heroic. So, which is why Christianity has that phrase heroic virtue of doing more than you can be
Sure.
expected to do. Um, and
And
I think that's the thing I'm trying to get at anyway. That it's
absolutely.
only truly the inspiring hero if it's the guy who went out of his way to do something that no one would have thought ill of him for not doing.
And I'm going to agree with you very much on that. And I'm going to give a real world example that's probably going to piss off half your viewers. Um, something that irritates me quite a lot. And I'm gonna hit some sacred American cows, and really probably piss off half my readers too, and lose all my audience. But um, we've created an art form in modern America of taking certain subgroups of people in particular careers and just taken to calling all of them heroes.
Mm.
Um, the specific ones that have gotten really bad are teachers and law enforcement and first responders and soldiers as well. And I'm going to pick on soldiers first because that's actually the subgroup where the majority of the ones that I know actually agree with the assessment. They're really tired of everybody treating them that way. It's a look. I have a great respect for soldiers, a lot of respect for what they do. Okay. But a soldier who enlists and signs up and goes over and basically does his job isn't is doing a good thing, is doing something that should be valued by society, but is not a hero because of exactly what you said. They're not going above and beyond. They're doing what they signed up for. It's yes, it's a much more difficult and crappier job than a lot of other people take that requires more sacrifice than most of us take. But at the same time, the soldier who signs up and just does his job is doing a job. You know, um, the teacher who signs up and does their job as a teacher is not a hero. They're just doing their job as a teacher. And like you said, a hero is someone who's going above and beyond and making some kind of real sacrifice to do so. And there are heroes who are soldiers, there are heroes who are teachers, there are heroes who are police officers and firefighters and all of those other things. There definitely are, but just being in that profession, in my opinion, does not automatically make you a hero. And we've taken to treating some of those groups that way in our culture, and it has very negative consequences as well. Like it becomes at a point where you can't actually, sometimes in my opinion, that gets used to shut down debate. Sometimes, like you can't talk to me that way. I'm a heroic teacher. You can't. Well, you're a teacher, okay? I mean, and sometimes it is an actual, honestly heroic teacher who's making that call. But I know several teachers who are like, well, I work 80 hours a week. Blah blah blah. I'm like, I work 80 hours a week. Am I heroic for it? 80 hours a week. I run 2 businesses and have a full-time job. 80 hours a week is actually a light work for week for me, right? That's an easy week. I'd love to only work 80 hours a week, right? So, and I claim no heroism for that. It's a choice that I've made to live my life the way I'm choosing to live it. We have a warped definition of what heroism is. And I think that a lot of it comes down to exactly what you're saying, is that heroism is going above and beyond what you are expected to do in the role you're in. And if you've chosen to be in the role of a teacher, there is an expectation of what you're supposed to do as a teacher, and doing just that is not heroic. That's just doing the role that you're in. And so here I've gone and I've pissed off everybody, but
well, actually, to give, I think, a little bit of context to your point, because some people will go on and say, well, most of it, people aren't required to be teachers, but some go on to it, or people aren't required to be soldiers, and some people step up, and it is true. The thing is too, for soldiers, and I think one of the reasons why soldiers that would agree with this, because if you look at statistically what the most soldiers do, our modern army is especially a very logistics heavy army. Being highly technologized, it's very logistics heavy, and so I could easily see how somebody who it is certainly they did service to their country, so without in any way taking from that, if what you did is you went to say Iraq, and you drove a truck and you never got fired at, certain times of this I'm talking about because I've been there for a freaking long time, but you happen to be one of the people who wasn't shot at. Other people have been, other people were maimed, other people were killed, but you drove the truck carrying supplies back and forth as part of the normal operations, and you were at risk, but you didn't actually see anything bad happen. It'd be really weird to get called a hero for that when that there are people who sacrificed far more than you did, and moreover, there are people who were in situations where they did go far and above and beyond what would be.
And more than just knowing that, most of those people, most of the soldiers who were over there actually personally know the people who were actual heroes, going above and beyond, sacrificing. It's not just that they know those people exist. Like, a lot of times they were there when it happened. They've seen the guy do it. And when you've been around an actual hero actually doing something, it's a little embarrassing to be compared to that when you don't feel like you've actually earned it. And I know a lot of soldiers who feel that way. They're like, no, I didn't do anything heroic. It's like, that's this guy over here, you know? And, you know, that's in that community, that's a very common point of view, which is why I pulled them out, because so many of them that I know actually view it exactly that way.
Yeah, I mean, moreover, part of it stems too. I mean, soldiers get used as political pawns, and I think that's one part
it
of.
is.
There are many threads that get woven into a fabric.
So do teachers and police officers and firefighters as well, and I think that's part of what's happening to them too.
Yeah, so there's the political pawn aspect of, wait, the thing you're doing is going to harm this group, and they're heroes. So that's one thread that goes into this, which is pretty despicable, and I think most everybody will tend to agree using people as a pawn in your political game is fairly despicable. So like that's one thread, and I think one legitimate, one reason why soldiers might well do it. Another is, I think, and somewhat specific to soldiers, because so many people don't know soldiers, so many people have never even met a soldier, so many people have their only knowledge of this. A friend of mine who had he had served in the army in the Fulda Gap during the Cold War, in which they were going to be the first people to die if the Soviets did anything. But so much of their job was to be around to be killed, triggering a full scale retaliation, which is the reason why they never actually invaded through the Fulda Gap. So they were kind of essentially using themselves as hostages to protect the Germans, basically. It's a weird sort of setup, and occasionally helped East Germans who crossed, and a bunch of other things. But that's the way he described it. But it's interesting he's saying, working in like interviewing for civilian positions after he'd retired from the army. And he remembered, he told me a story of one woman who was saying something about like, well, we in this place, something different than the army culture you're used to. And he said, what do you think the army culture I'm used to is? At which point she's stuttering, and like, I forget whether or not she managed to pull out a trope or two from a movie, but like a Full Metal Jacket type trope.
Right.
But like that was about as far as it was. He was like, how do you think the military actually works in practice?
Yeah.
Well, cause she was just caught in the fact that like she was just thinking of this in terms of movies. But I think another thing is a lot of people dehumanize soldiers because they only think of them as characters in movies, not as actual people living real lives. And being in the, if you actually look at the statistics, being in the military is dangerous, but it's not that dangerous. I mean, it's absolutely
not the
statistically
American
speaking,
Army
it's not that
in
dangerous.
the 21st century. I'll tell you a funny anecdote related to that. Talking about it not being that dangerous, and this is a little bit less true since then, but the general principle is actually still basically true. In the first Gulf War, in Operation Desert Storm in '91, the casualty rates in that war on the American side were so low that it was the first time in history where it was statistically safer for a soldier to be at war than at peace.
Good training accidents.
The training accidents before and after the war, when they were training, were deadlier than the war itself for a soldier. And the second Iraq War and Afghanistan have obviously not gone as well as the first Gulf War did. So it's less true there, but the casualty rates are historically very, very low for that. And so what you're saying is absolutely right. It is dangerous, but it's not clear that it's radically more dangerous than, say, offshore oil well digging. I mean, that's a pretty or logging, or any number of other jobs that the same general class of blue collar worker does in the civilian world. It's those jobs are dangerous as well, and statistically probably about on par these days. Maybe not quite as dangerous, but unlike the past where it would have been maybe 100 times more dangerous or 1,000 times more dangerous to be the soldier, Today, it's maybe 2 or 3 times more dangerous to be the soldier, which is definitely a change, but it's not like you're living in a dramatically different risk world by
Yeah.
doing it.
And no, there are definitely stresses that go along with being in the military, because knowing that people
Absolutely.
want to kill you is a different thing than knowing that logs might fall on you and kill you,
Absolutely.
even if statistically there may be similarities there. So,
Yeah.
again,
And it's a rough life. And I have a great respect for the people who do it, because many of them are at least partially motivated by the desire to serve their country. And I don't mean to denigrate that at all. I applaud that and do respect that.
yeah. But talking about the subjective psychological reasons why, I mean, okay, there's the modesty of everyone will say, oh, I'm not a hero. So I mean, there, obviously there's the, modesty suggests that everyone should disclaim this, but at the same time, there's a very legitimate psychological reason why most people who served would want the term hero reserved to people who did something they regard as far more heroic than anything they themselves did, even if within the general populace there's still, it comes, I think a lot of it comes down to a lot of people want an incredibly binary thinking,
Yeah.
either either better or worse, and that's it.
Yeah.
As opposed to, for example, we can honor soldiers for the service to their country, which
Right.
is a level of honor above the general public, and then honor heroes as above those who serve but
Exactly.
didn't do anything like those
Exactly.
who.
That's a much better way of saying it than what I've been saying. I actually I agree with that completely. It's the point I'm trying to make. And but getting back to the topic, that's absolutely true in our fiction as well these days. And something else you said is something that really bugs me a lot, and I've even written some blog posts about this. But there's been a trend in popular fiction again recently toward something that I think is very highly related to what you've been talking about, and you kind of mentioned this too. Towards the hero is the hero because he's the chosen one.
Hmm.
For whatever reason it is. You have like
Man, do I have some deeply cynical reasons for that one. But anyway.
yeah, well, I mean whatever the plot reason is for that.
Sorry.
The meta reason why it's happening in culture, I have some cynical reasons for as well myself. But you have cases like Harry Potter. Why is Harry Potter the hero? If you read the books, like for most of the books, Harry doesn't actually do much that's particularly special. Why is
Yeah, I've
Harry the
heard that his
hero?
friends are more heroic than he is.
They certainly are as heroic, and in some cases, definitely more heroic. Why is Harry the hero? Because he's the chosen one, right? Because of an accident that happened right when he was born and a prophecy that was told about him. And then even that is a matter of chance to some degree, because the prophecy could have been about 2 different people, but it was about him because the Dark Lord thought it was about him and made it a self-fulfilling prophecy. Sorry if I've just spoiled the entire series for everybody. Actually, not so much. But the big example that I really like to give a lot, though, is actually Star Wars, and this is one of my personal problems with where the series has gone. Not just with the new sequel trilogy, but even the original prequel trilogy was heading this way. The original Star Wars film is very much a it's very much a common man film, right?
Mhm.
Luke Skywalker is an anybody. He's an everyman. He's a farm boy out on a desert planet who just does what he needs to do in the right time, goes above and beyond, makes some dreadful personal sacrifices. His aunt and his uncle are destroyed, and he gives up his whole life and, faces down the most horrible weapon there is, and prevails against all of it, because he, manages to, find his inner force and strength and connect with the universe and everything. And then you can see, even by Return of the Jedi, this is starting to happen a little, but it really comes in big into play in the prequel trilogy. where it really starts to become more and more where no, he wasn't just an average, an anybody farm boy. He's the scion of this great family, and
Although someone
he's
pointed out, like, this great family that extends back exactly half a generation. Well,
right,
one
but
generation, I suppose.
yes, I know that is actually amusing now that you bring it up. But in theory, if you're buying into what's going on in some of the, especially in the Phantom Menace, this his father was like the most powerful Jedi ever, and was conceived by the midichlorians, and all of this. And so, look, from our Christian perspective, let's not miss the metaphor that's right in your face with a 2x4. He's the last scion of the God incarnated, right? And it's like, I like the story better when he's an everyman.
Yeah.
And I think he's far more heroic of a character when he's an everyman than when he's born into the role. And and I've seen a trend in this direction in films and in other forms of pop culture as well. And I'm personally not overly thrilled with it. I'm a fan of the everyman. Um,
Well, every man has much more of an ability to be heroic.
he does. Yeah. He does. He doesn't have special powers. He doesn't have wonderful things. He doesn't have the entire aristocratic family of generations to lean on. He doesn't have massive wealth. He's just the everyman. And I,
And as a result, he by not having much, he has the ability to go beyond what's expected of him much,
right.
much more readily.
I also have a feeling myself, the story of the everyman rising above and becoming great is the quintessential American story, right? Like that's our myth as a nation, is the everyman becoming all that you could possibly be. And I find it very disturbing that American popular culture is losing that myth. And maybe it's always been a myth. I'm not arguing whether it has ever been real or not, but I find it disturbing that we're losing that myth
Yeah, well, I
and
mean,
moving away from it.
myths are incredibly important, and I mean, foundational myths are incredibly important because,
Exactly.
I mean, whether or not they ever happened is, with the one exception of C.S. Lewis has this great essay about myth becoming real. That in Christianity, what you have is myth becoming actually fulfilled by reality, because the
Right.
myth existed to tell you about something, and then here you actually have reality fulfilling itself. So and in this argument that I won't get into, but about reality ringing down through the centuries and in all directions, becoming a foreshadowing of itself. So I mean, there's that asterisk, like if your salvation depends on this, it better actually be real. But that aside, foundational myths, it's really irrelevant whether they're true or not, because a foundational myth tells you not nearly so much really where you came from, but where you're supposed to be going. I mean, that's the
Exactly.
purpose of a foundational myth.
That is exactly why it bothers me that it's going away in a nutshell. And it's a cultural change that's coming with it that I don't think is a good change for
Yeah,
our
now
nation.
I will say, if I had to bet money, where will things be in like 30 to 40 years? And granted, that's a safe time to bet money because very few people will ever hold me to it. But nonetheless, if I did, I think it's likely to come back, because I think there's several different reasons why we're seeing this dynastic sort of thing.
Yeah.
And one of which is a sort of nihilism combined with egoism, that's popular, especially amongst where a lot of writers come from. So I mean, I do think there is that, but I think another big thing is there's a lot of writing laziness involved, because of course there's that great moment of Luke, "I am your father," and that astonishing shock, that strangeness of it, that twist. Well, if you make everybody related, twists become really easy to throw in. It's
Right.
really, really straightforward to point out that, like, you know, I am your father's cousin's best friend's roommate, uncle. Does that make us? Absolutely nothing, which is what you are about to become. From Spaceballs, if anyone doesn't get the reference. But, you know, that sort of twist is easy. And so if you do that, like, it becomes really, really straightforward. And writers are often quite lazy. But I think that, you know, and the thing is, people who have recently remembered the foundational myths can do without them for a decade or two.
Yeah.
Because they remember them so well. Like, okay, we're doing other stuff now. You still remember where you came from. It's going to have its effects on the people who are growing up right now, but that's a different matter. But I think that over time, you can only rely on people's memories for so long before they start to really long for the things that they need a lot more than where you're playing. And so I do think that we're going to see a pretty big return to the story of the everyman who becomes everything he can be, precisely because when that's been absent for a while, people are going to start to really feel its lack, and consequently, when somebody writes that story, they're going to start to become really, really popular again. So I do think that part of that is people can take their patrimony for granted, roughly speaking. And that's dangerous because you might lose it. But on the other hand, I do think there's an element in which what we're seeing now, people are getting away with in their writing precisely because people are taking their patrimony for granted as opposed to rejecting their patrimony.
As a writer who is trying to write those kinds of stories, I really hope you're right. Because if you're correct, that could be very lucrative for me. And I definitely think you might be. It's hard to say. I think we could have an entire discussion on that topic alone, rather than everything
one of the most popular animes, somewhat recent, within the last 10 years or something, is one called Gurren Lagann, which was actually done by the same people who did Neon Genesis Evangelion. Now, my friend is really, really, really into anime, and I'm very much out of my league. But the interesting thing, and he loved the heck out of this, and it's the story of some kid who essentially comes into some contact with the villain and decides he's not going to take it, and then leads the fight against them, and just will never give up and keeps on conquering until eventually, and there are like 3 or 4 levels of bad guys that he keeps on conquering his way up, and he gets to what's supposed to be the final battle where like you sacrifice yourself to put the main villain to sleep for another 100 years, and he says, no, I'm not doing that, I'm winning, and goes and defeats him. And this story was extremely popular and taken very much as like a breath of fresh air, that they're not just, that the main character is not simply going to fulfill some prophecy and be the one. He's like, screw this, I'm winning. And that is very much that American, everyman who is everything he can be. So, I mean, I do think that, granted that Gurren Lagann was made by the Japanese, but it's very popular amongst the American fans. So, I mean, just one little bit of evidence there, but I do think we're going to see that. Now, there's, especially as, as we're seeing, the genre shift we're seeing is as Dead Tree Publishing is getting more and more heard, and ebook publishing is becoming more and more of a thing, producing space for the independents, a space that well. That as the people who misunderstand how this new space actually works and is producing a lot of room for people to experiment and find out how it really works and make new people, that's also where I think there's a lot of space for, a changing over of the guard in terms of the sorts of stories that people write and the sorts of stories that people are willing to publish, because people who don't have 30 years experience in how things had just been going are willing to do very different things. So I think there's good reason to hope it's coming.
Obviously, I agree with that, or I wouldn't be in the business that I'm in. I think that there is a market for stories of a kind that aren't being produced. And although I will say that a lot of them actually are being produced right now, they're just being produced by people who don't have the means to get them in front of a wide audience, which is something we're trying to actually help with a lot.
The other trick, too, for all of us who try to write these stories is going to be that it's still going to be people who are used to the way things have been done recently who will be reading them. So
Right.
even though they may need a breath of fresh air, this ties very much into what we were saying before, you still have to be aware of the tropes that people are used to. You still have to, even if you're doing something different, it has to have enough of a recognizable structure. So that's going to be the real challenge, to not simply throw away the last 20 years and then write stuff that people won't be able to understand because it doesn't speak any of the language they're used to.
It is a challenge. And of course, it remains to be seen how successful any of us will be at it. But if it weren't a challenge, it wouldn't be fun, right?
No, it's very true. I mean, that one I mentioned just in the spirit more of it's something I think that because I mean it's anytime you have a situation, you see this with the Latin Mass in Catholic circles, and this is kind of verging on Catholic inside baseball, but there's the Latin Mass community where most Catholics celebrate according to, the Eucharist is held in the Novus Ordo, which was promulgated in the 1970s, and or it might have been the 60s, but in any event, celebrating the customary vernacular within America, English by and large, and so on. And there's a small community of people whose basic reaction to society's going to hell in a handbasket is, let's just go back to before 1960. Let's go back to at least the 1950s, maybe the 1650s, and just sort of go over there. And that's clearly better than what we have now. And you'll search far and wide to find somebody who says, for example, that the hymn books that we use currently when celebrating the Novus Ordo and the customary vernacular are very good, by and large. But at the same time, there is that instinct of, let's just throw out everything. It's right. Almost like, to take a programming metaphor, let's just do a git reset to a certain point in the past when we know the code worked. And man, is that way too specific a metaphor to use here? But in any event, way too niche to programming, I mean. But to just let's throw out, let's identify some point that worked, throw out everything that happened afterwards, go back then and see if we can't do it better following. That's one approach, and it's always very tempting, and there'll always be people who do it, and always be people who have some success. The Latin Mass is actually very popular within its niche. But at the same time, there's also the thing that I think, which is more like what you and I and many other people we know are trying to do in the, let's try to get from here to there going forward rather than by resetting. Not that there's anything inherently necessarily wrong with resetting, but if you can start from here, there are a lot of people you can bring with you who aren't going back.
Well, I might even be a little stronger than that and say that you really can't go home again. A lot of times people do look at that and they start to think, well, if we could just go back to that time, things would be simpler. But certain subgroups may be able to do that. But our culture is just not going back to the 1950s in America. It's just not going to happen. As much as some subgroups may want that to happen, it isn't. You can't drag the culture that you can't drag 300 million people back to the 1950s. It's just not going to work. There's a whole laundry list of reasons for that. Some of which is that for large subsets of that population, the 1950s was not a good time. And they're just not going to follow you back to that. And so you really do, if you want to bring the population as a whole with you, you've got to move forward. You don't really have another choice. You can't go back. It's a mantra of a little bit that my wife would laugh if she ends up watching this to hear me say it, because she hears me say it all the time. And the answer is, well, that's great. How do you get there from here? and that's something that we have She hears that a lot because I bring that up in our business dealings a lot. Like, well, yes, we'd like to be over there. That's where we'd like our business to be, but how do we get there from here? And the answer is very often that it's either not easy, or sometimes the answer is, well, you can't. You've got to go somewhere else rather than there, because from where we are right now, there's no way to get there. And that's something that a lot of people just don't even think about. The libertarian ideal of, hey, if we could just roll back all these regulations that we've had over the last 50 years, then we'd live in this wonderful society. Well, you can't just roll back all those regulations. You could roll back regulations and probably possibly get good results. But if you just roll back the regulations, then what you have is 2 generations of people who have been raised knowing nothing but those regulations and don't know how to cope in a world without them anymore. And that doesn't mean they can't learn to cope, but what it means is that just getting rid of the regulations doesn't take you back to what you had before. Healthcare is the best possible example I can think of. Healthcare is insanely regulated. It's insanely regulated. And a big portion of the problem with healthcare is actually the existence of health insurance as we know it. Right? This is actually a large portion of the problem of why our healthcare system is so messed up right now. Health insurance as we know it is a crazy product that should never have really existed, and it only exists now because of an accident of bureaucratic history from the 1950s. But if we eliminated everything to do with insurance right now, with health insurance, the market would collapse, because the market is built around the health insurance that we have. So you have this libertarian ideal of getting rid of all of that, which at an abstract theoretical level, I personally actually absolutely agree with. But at an immediate level, looking at the world on the ground, it's a case of, how do you get there from here? Because if we just eliminate all the regulations, it doesn't take us back to a world before health insurance. It takes us to a post-health insurance world, which is a different beast. And,
the way people behave, what they anticipate, right, how they interpret things. Yeah.
I mean, just imagine that. I mean, 50 years ago, the cost of medicine was so much cheaper. And when people have to pay their own costs, that tends to keep the price cheaper. But if we eliminated every regulation in the healthcare market today, what would your price be to go see the doctor tomorrow when you catch the flu in this horrible flu season that's going around this year? Nobody knows. The doctor doesn't know what to charge you anymore. You don't know what you should be paying. You don't know how much your medicine's going to cost you afterwards. The drug manufacturer doesn't know what they can charge and get away with. The pharmacy doesn't know what they need to mark it up by anymore. Nobody knows how this is going to work. And so you can't just eliminate all the regulation. You've got to...
You need a 10-year plan.
Yeah, you need a plan. You need a plan to work through it, because if you just strike all the rules today, you have chaos, and you have nothing but chaos. And that's...
And what's worse is no acclimation period.
What?
I mean, even if you had chaos, if you raised people to be used to chaos,
right?
Because in 1540, their medical care was extremely limited in comparison, and they had no health insurance, and things were fairly chaotic, but they were raised in a world in which they were chaotic, and so they knew how to live in a world that was chaotic.
Right. Exactly. And we don't know how to, any American alive today basically doesn't know how to live in a world without health insurance anymore. It's just, they don't, except for maybe a very small subset who are nearly dead from old age. And that's even assuming that the hardcore libertarians are right, and that's really a better approach. if they / we, myself included, are wrong, then we've really created a disaster. And you know, so again, it's something you have to think about with any of these things. You know, rolling society back sounds great, but how do you get there from here?
Yeah, yeah, it's a and that's why I think it's important for it's important for people who are, you know, looking at the state of literature, storytelling generally, to think about. I mean, to some degree, it's almost impossible not to think in modern terms anyway. Um, but to you know, think about, you know, not just, you know, the sort of stories you want to tell that haven't been told much recently, but to also pay attention to how do you put this, you know, how do you, especially how do you start off by telling the sort of story in current genres,
Right.
and then once you've been telling the story in current genres for a bit, then you can start creating new genres as people get used to the structure, and you can wean them off of the previous genre because people like change anyway. So it's something to think about anyway. I don't in any sense mean it as an insuperable obstacle or anything like that, but rather just it's a good idea going forward to have a sense of what are the things that you need to be spending effort in doing and making sure you don't get wrong. You know, and I know especially myself, since you know, books that I like heavily include things like those written by G.K. Chesterton, those written by Dorothy L. Sayers. You know, I don't read that many books by people who are still alive, frankly, especially you know, and so, you know, this may be especially a you know, a temptation for me, but you know, so many of my reference are much older. You know, to a time when genres are different, and you know, it's still the case. A lot of people read Sherlock Holmes, for example. So you know, if you reference something, even though it's old, like Sherlock Holmes, and so on. So anyway, not to belabor the point, because I think that this seems like a pretty good point, I think, to conclude on, actually, that we've it's been a decent trajectory, I think.
I think so.
Um, so yeah,
Definitely.
so well, thank you very much for joining me. It's been a great conversation.
Thanks for having me on, Chris. I enjoyed it, and look forward to coming back again sometime in the future. It's always fun.
You too.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that as much as I enjoyed being in that conversation. And until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.